Hey guys, Jason here from shorin-ryu. I got a request from you guys to talk a little bit about generating power and speed in some of our very common basic techniques, and to give my thoughts on some of that. So I put together this quick video for you guys focusing on Jodan-nuke, focusing on Chun-ski, middle punch, and focusing on Chudan-nuke, middle block. So hopefully you guys like the video. Please leave your comments and questions at the bottom and I'll be sure to get back to you, okay? So here we go, thank you. For better or worse, Jodan-nuke has, become sort of the poster child of this idea of how to manufacture velocity in your technique, and we see all sorts of variations because students are, we're always trying to follow the direction of our sensei, and often we'll hear, about these ideas of developing more speed, more power. And at least in the early stages of your training, if you don't sort of understand how to do that properly, then your body will adapt the way that it considers proper, and you will start to develop idiosyncrasies in your technique. And we see this all the time. And going back to Jodan-nuke, it's one sort of prime example of this, and many people could probably relate to this. This idea. So here we are. We're doing Jodan-nuke. And if we were to do the cross decks across the deck and started looking for this, we'd probably see it. There's a propensity to sort of drop the arm down before racing back up with it again into the final position. And if you're looking purely from a logical standpoint, the reason for doing this actually kind of makes sense, right? Because again, the student is trying to accelerate into the technique, but they're not accelerating using their core, right? They're unfortunately accelerating using shoulders and arms, which is something that we talk a lot about, not wanting to develop those habits, not wanting to rely on shoulders and arms to develop proper technique, but instead relying on the core. But of course, if you're not shown how to do that, you fall into some of the more common traps, right? And Jodan-nuke is one of these things, and you'll see lots of times when we're doing techniques like Jodan-nuke, there's a propensity to sort of almost do a geidan ski before doing the Jodan-nuke. So the technique starts to look a little bit more like that, like the technique comes down and up. It's almost like a giant hook happens, right? Because the student knows, at least, that if there's a certain amount of distance from where the technique starts to where the technique finishes, and if they can increase that distance between the start and finish, then there's more distance for them to accelerate, right? So as they're coming up, they're giving themselves more time to accelerate the technique, so that by the time they reach, the last third, we'll say, of the technique, their technique's moving pretty fast, right? So logically, the reason for wanting to sort of drop down before coming back up makes sense, because the student is simply trying to emulate the sensei's instruction of more speed, right? More speed equals more power. When instead, really your Jodan-nuke should actually be compressed, and instead of relying on arm and shoulder to sort of accelerate up into the technique, really you should be compressing and contracting with your abs and your core muscles and your glutes and even your thighs and down into the legs, right? Like, that's the idea of Kime, is this idea of like this full body tightening, right? And we can use that idea of Kime to help the body produce the acceleration, the desired acceleration in the technique, so that when you're finally in the last third of that technique, you are at the speed that you want to be at, but you're not relying on using your shoulders and your arms, right? So instead of sort of doing something that looks like that, which is that big dip that I talked about, right? Instead, you want to contract, right? Like, you should actually feel your height, your whole body sort of sink down a little bit, right? So it's more like, right? And the technique comes more from inside the chamber, right? I talk about this, right? There's like a corridor of power, right? There's 100 different ways to say the same thing, right? There's a corridor of power. There's core muscles, right? There's abs and core and glutes that all make up, this sort of core muscle group, right? Which creates this kind of corridor of power. And that's where you want to bring your mind's eye, right? When you're doing your technique. You don't want to be thinking arms and hands, because then you get into this sort of mechanical karate, right? Where now it's like, how do I use my arms and my shoulders, my biceps and my shoulders to like manufacture speed, right? And the body will come up with creative ways to do that. And one of those ways is, as we see at Jorin-ryu, is this, this big sort of dip that happens. You see the hand comes down before it comes back up, right? And that's a way to manufacture that speed. When instead what a student should be focusing on is forget the end result, speed. Speed is the end result, forget that. Instead, focus on what am I doing with my core, or that chamber of power, corridor of power. What am I doing in there? What's the coordination of movements that are happening in there in order to generate the speed? Because the speed will come. If you coordinate properly with your core muscle group, a result of that will be speed. So take a step back with students and really start focusing on this idea of contracting, okay? Tipping the pelvis when appropriate, right? Locking in with the abs, locking in, like the glutes are so involved in this, locking in with the glutes, and you'll see the body, these little nuances in technique, right? This idea of tightening the core as you then use that, right, to fire the technique, okay? The technique should be coming off the core. Shouldn't be coming off the shoulders. You shouldn't be trying to manufacture speed by doing these big movements, because A, it ultimately ends up being slower, and B, you're going to hurt your shoulder, right? You're going to injure yourself, especially if you're doing that for years and years and years and years. With any kind of proficiency, like with any kind of real speed and real power, that wear and tear on the shoulder will really start to reveal itself later. You should try to keep the movements compact, right? In the chamber, right? Using just, right? It should just fire right from there. You can see that little movement just firing right from that position. So that's my thought on this idea of manufacturing acceleration by using shoulders and arms when it, as it pertains to Jodan uke. We talked too about just doing punch, and again this idea of focusing in on your core muscle group, and obviously the punch is probably the poster child of martial arts techniques, right? It's the one thing that everybody thinks about when you think about karate. You think about that typical, very picturesque sort of finished position, right? You've got your higite, you're sort of performing that traditional karate technique, okay? But there's a lot of things to keep in mind when doing that. And again, it all kind of comes back to focusing again in on the core. You want to keep the energy inside the corridor, okay? And what I mean by that is, and I'm going to focus specifically on the shoulder here because I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways, right? When you're executing your chudanski, there's a propensity for a lot of things to start happening with the shoulders, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about Jodan uke, a high block, where if you're not taught how to do something properly, your body will start to explore options and different ways to try to get to where you want to be, and that's and those different idiosyncrasies that we develop, they become sort of like the flaws in our techniques if they're not properly addressed at some point during training, and then reinforced by repetition and continued practice, right? So chudanski is a great example of this. We'll see, and again, I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this, right? You'll see all kinds of things. You'll see punches where the elbow sort of flies out and you kind of get this sort of chicken wing kind of punch, right? It looks a little bit like that, right? You'll get that kind of thing. You'll get punches where this actually is related to the chicken wing. You'll get the thing where like you'll get the punch coming out and then you'll almost get the wrist will lead the hand, right? So then and I'm exaggerating. There's different levels of this. There's different levels of how serious of a problem this can develop in your punch. But for example, you can sometimes get into situations where you see students doing their punch and their elbow is almost leading their knuckle, and then the punch sort of like flicks out at the end, right? And again, that is this idea that by getting the shoulder involved, the student can manufacture the velocity that they're looking for in the technique, okay? Because again, they're trying to get to a quick, speedy, more speed, more power is the thing that we hear a lot of instruction around this in karate, right? When instead, you don't want to let the the shoulder venture outside the corridor of this corridor of power that I talk about, right? So we have this corridor of power, which is like, if you were to draw a rectangle down, right? You want to try to generate all of the power from within this shape, okay? And if you start letting arms sort of fly out or away from the center of your body, you essentially like lose power doing this. You have to manufacture the speed and power, and you're prone to injury, and just as a general rule, sort of improper technique, you know? So what I like to do with students is when we're doing things like just middle punch, I want them to focus on, think about, well, two things. The first thing is, think about like a clothes hanger, right? And wet clothes sort of hanging, if this is the shape of a clothes hanger, right? The wet clothes are sort of draping off of the sides of the hangers, right? And that, I want to build in the student's mind, in their mind's eye there, that the shoulder is not sort of out and away from the body like this. It's more like sagging and hanging in, you know, and as we do that, the shoulder kind of collapses back in on your center. And again, you're now within that sort of corridor of power that I like to talk about, right? So the punch really kind of it kind of comes from there. It doesn't come out, right? It doesn't come up like this, where the shoulders are like up now, almost in line with the jaw. Okay, the punch should start and should end in almost this sort of like draped, damp laundry look, or sort of a sagging feeling where your shoulders are relaxed and down, right? So the punch is more like from here, it's more, right? You're always, right? And then relax, right? You know, it's not like, and then relax. There shouldn't be this big change in the shape of the punch, right? It should be, right, relax, but the shoulder is still sagging, right? So that's what I like to focus on. You know, there's a million areas to sort of focus on when we're talking about any given karate technique, but the shoulders is really a big hot button item for students, particularly who are newer in training, and they want to manufacture that speed, so they start to like invent ways to do that, when really they should really just be sort of focusing their mind's eye, staying inside this corridor, nice and relaxed on the shoulders, and using this energy generating machine here, which is your core, to right, accelerate into the technique, okay? Chudan uke, you know, I get a lot of questions around transition positions for different techniques, okay? I've had questions about the transition position for pretty much every karate technique that there is, but let's talk about Chudan uke, right? So Chudan uke, you know, this block, you want to think like when you're doing a block, if, you know, from a practical standpoint, all right, if we're talking about being pragmatic, right, you may not actually even have a chance to get the block out, okay? And you'll often see this, you know, if you're engaged in kumite, like how often are you doing kumite where someone throws a technique and you execute like a perfect Chudan uke? Like it just never happens, right? Because there's no time. You know, by the time you have a chance to react, if you're doing kumite at a fairly high level, by the time you have a chance to react to any given technique, the other person is already on their way to the next thing, right? They've executed a technique and they're moving on to the next technique. So you can't get caught up in this idea where every technique that you do is going to be, you're going to be able to finish it to a perfect state, okay? Particularly when we're talking about kumite. So there's this. So then we talk about these transition, these you know, arm positions mid technique, and we'll just talk about Chudan uke, right? So Chudan uke, you know, if let's say I'm in my kumite position or whatever, if someone goes to throw a technique, maybe my block, maybe this is my block, right? Maybe my block is just getting the arms up to cover the body, right? That could be the block, right? This could be the block. So it's an important aspect of your technique. You don't want to leave it out, because in kumite, since there is such little time to respond to a technique, you know, assuming it's coming at you with any sort of velocity, you're not going to be able to get to this position, okay? The technique is going to be come and gone before you before you even have time to react, right? So sometimes, you know, this is the block. Okay, so these transition positions are very important, and for Chudan Uke, there's a couple of different schools of thought on this, and you know, neither is wrong, neither is right. There's just a different way of looking at it. Some techniques they come from down here, right? You guys probably remember drawing the sword was an analogy that was probably used quite a bit when you were coming up through the ranks, right? Remember to draw the sword, right? Remember to come down low, right? There's a sword hilt here somewhere. You're grabbing it, and then you're sort of drawing it out, okay? Or a little bit more of a modern take on that is instead of having the hands come down low, this hand sort of almost stays parallel to the ground, and you're just sort of covering like this. And the idea is you're not having to reach so far up, right? So there's less time is required to get from here to here, as opposed to coming from here all the way up to here. So this is like a shortened version of that technique. But in either case, both positions are important to have an appreciation for, because if you're not training with at least, you know, a portion of your thought on the fact that this may actually be this, or this may actually be the block, then if you don't have an understanding of that, then it may not come in handy should you ever need to use it. So when you're doing your Chudan Uke, for example, make sure that you are paying attention to these middle positions. Okay, middle positions, covering and blocking, covering and blocking, and of course the same thing applies to Jodan Uke, right? So talk with your instructors about the cover positions, understand them and appreciate them, because, you know, they are there for a reason.